If we've learnt anything from The Lord of the Rings about just rings in general, it's that they are powerful and they are dangerous, and I'm currently wearing a lot of them. Make of that what you will. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, or a Tolkien fan in general, you probably know a fair amount about the Rings of Power. I mean, they're pretty vital to the whole story of Lord of the Rings, if we're being honest. But I got thinking during this week, while I was trying to figure out what to make another long video about, that while we know a fair amount of how they came to be, there's actually quite a lot of mystery still surrounding them. And I think in this episode, I want to dig into that a little bit, see what we know about the rings. Maybe there's something that you didn't know before that I can enlighten for you, and just generally find out a little bit more about their fate. Let's dive into it. So first of all, I'm sure there are plenty of Tolkien fans, Tolkien nerds like me, who are out there watching. But also for anyone who might be new, who doesn't know too much about the rings in general, let's start right at the beginning, shall we? What exactly are the Rings of Power? Now, if you've watched the Rings of Power series, you'll maybe know a little bit about it. The Rings of Power were created by Celebrimbor, who is the grandson of Fëanor, who is arguably the greatest Noldorin elf ever to exist. He was highly skilled in crafts, in languages. He made the Silmarils, he made Tengwar, he made the Palantiri, all of that great stuff. So he comes from a line of master craftsmen, and he made the Rings of Power under the encouragement of Sauron. How did that happen? How could he possibly have been willing to help someone who's so evil? Well, at that time, Sauron, in order to deceive the elves, was able to take on another form, a very beautiful form called Anatar, who was also known as the Lord of Gifts. And what Celebrimbor thought he was doing was creating these rings and imbuing them with the power to preserve the lands of Middle-earth so that they retain the same beauty as Valinor for as long as possible. Kind of stopping the decay of the world, I guess. And altogether, there were 20 Rings of Power. 19 of those rings were forged by Celebrimbor, and of course, the one ring, the most infamous of them all, was forged by Sauron in secret without the knowledge of any of the elves or Celebrimbor. In fact, the 3 elven rings were actually forged without Sauron's knowledge, but I'll get back to that in just a second. It's really interesting to note, and I'll also come back to this at the end, that many lesser rings were made, and all of them had some level of power. It's mentioned in the Silmarillion, but if you've seen the Fellowship of the Ring movie, it's also mentioned by Gandalf, I believe near the beginning. I wonder if I can find the quote somewhere. But he mentions to Bilbo that there are many powerful rings in the world, and none of them should be taken lightly. He wasn't kidding. There are more than the 20 that we know of, and who knows where they might be. So as the poem goes, right at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, if you've seen it or read it, there are 9 rings for mortal men, 7 for the dwarf lords, 3 for the elves, and the 1 ring to quite literally rule and control them all. But here's my first question. Who were the bearers exactly? We know who held the 1 ring, we know a considerable amount about the 3 elven rings, but what about the 9 and what about the 7? I did a little bit of digging and here's what I found out. So in terms of the 9 rings, we know that Sauron gifted these to the race of men, and they were, I believe, the first to fall. Which says a lot about us as beings in general, I think, that we were the weakest of all the races and that we fell to the lure of the ring, first of all. But that's kind of the fatal flaw of humans, I suppose, that they have this desire for power that has stayed with us even up till now. The 9 easily bent to Sauron's will, and they became what we know as the Ringwraiths. But herein lies the next layer of questions. Who were the Ringwraiths? They could have been kings of men, and If you head to Weta Workshop's website, which I do very often, I love them very much, they have some really cool looking concept designs for the helms of each of the ring wraiths. I'll see if I can find some screenshots and maybe put them around here. But there are several concepts for a ring wraith from Rhûn, which is in the tribal east of Middle-earth, Khand, which is the southeast of Mordor, Forod, which is in the north, I believe, Harad, which is south, kind of desert jungle area. It's beyond Umbar. And then you've got the Witch King and all those other ones. I think it's very cool to imagine that each of the ring wraiths was a king or high lord from the race of men. The 7 dwarven rings, now who were they given to? It's worth noting here that 7 is a recurring number of quite some importance for the dwarves. When they were first created by Aule, the Valar, he made 7 dwarven fathers. And then from those dwarven fathers came the 7 dwarven clans. Now, the Rings of Power were created too late to be given to the dwarven fathers, but I imagine, and I'm pretty sure, that the rings would have been given to the heads or the kings of each of the existing dwarven clans. So those would be, and I had to write them down because I cannot remember this off the top of my head. You've got Durin's folk, the Firebeards, Broadbeams, Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots. So that's what we know about the 9 and the 7. But in terms of the Rings of Power in general, what became of them? As I mentioned before, the 3 Elven rings were created outside of Sauron's knowledge, and Celebrimbor's intention with those rings was to preserve beauty and not create war. But like all of the Rings of Power, when the one ring was destroyed, their power failed. And as a result, the Elven realms also began to fade, and I suppose that's when the elves knew that it was their time to go back to Valinor in the west. Of all the rings, aside from the One Ring, we know factually how these 3 ended up. All 3 of them went west with their bearers at the time. Those were Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, and they bore Nenya, Vilya, and Narya. Now, here's where it starts getting really unclear, and I would love to know in the comments what your speculation is, what happened to the rest of the rings, but let's have a rundown on the information that we know so far. Alright, in terms of the 9, this is very, very, very unclear. So, at the time of the War of the Ring, it's possible that the Nazgûl still had them, but then it's also possible that Sauron just took them back once each of the men fell to his power. It's actually quite interesting to note here that when the Witch King died, there was absolutely no mention of any ring being on his finger, and no one seemed particularly worried about it, which is kind of strange. So possibly the Nazgûl had them, possibly Sauron had them, we can't know for sure. In terms of the 7, so the Dwarven rings, we know for sure that 4 of them were consumed by dragons. The Dwarven Rings of Power are actually pretty interesting, so while Sauron created them in order to bring the dwarves under his control, fact of the matter is, they're too hardy, they're too hard-headed to come under his control. So with the Dwarven Rings, the 7 clans became very wealthy, but their spirits were just too tough, and Sauron just kind of was like, nope, I can't control these guys. But then their ruin came about anyway, because possession of the rings actually brought out the worst in the 7 dwarven kings, and just made them incredibly greedy and hoarding treasure in their halls, and it kind of brought them to ruin anyway. So 4 were consumed by dragons. But then what about the other 3? From what I could find out, Sauron took the other 3, and I believe it was before the War of the Ring, but he actually approached Dain Ironfoot and offered him the rings. But Dain, being an absolute bro, refused. So in that case, I suppose Sauron took them back, and as far as I know, that's the last we ever heard of the Dwarven Rings. So then, the last question that I have time for in this 10-minute video is, what became of the Rings of Power? The Elven Rings passed over the water, and the One Ring was destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. We know exactly what happened to those rings. The Elven kingdoms have faded away because they were no longer protected, and their beauty was no longer preserved. The Dwarf kingdoms are also gone, but that may not be related. They continued on well into the Fourth Age. Gimli started a new Dwarven kingdom underneath the Glittering Mountains. So here is where I'm going to turn over to you all. We don't know where the 9 human rings of power are. We don't know where the remaining 3 dwarven rings are. And about those lesser rings that are still apparently fairly dangerous according to Gandalf, where are they? No one knows. What if they still exist? What if they're hiding in the modern world? Now there's a speculative question. If the rings, even the lesser rings, existed in the modern world, would you take it? And what would you do with it? I'm interested to know. I'd love to know your thoughts and theories down in the comments below. Go crazy, I love reading everything that's on your minds. But while you all speculate, I'll say bye for now and thank you so much for watching as always. Please like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and go crazy in those comments, I can't wait. In the meantime, take care and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.